We're talking about the Progressive Era, and the most famous president of the Progressive Era is Teddy Roosevelt, known back then as TR. And Roosevelt was a pretty interesting guy who was not someone as a young boy you would have thought would be president. He was pretty sick as a young kid, sort of forced himself to be a wrestler and then a boxer, became a historian, wrote a couple of very famous books, went out on a ranch in Montana or in South Dakota and lived there and became a rancher for a while. Then he went to work for the government and was pretty much running the Department of Navy. And when the Spanish-American War broke out, he quit the Department of Navy, formed an all-volunteer cavalry to fight in the Spanish-American War called the Rough Riders, and became a war hero. And when he came back to his home state of New York, he ran for governor. And it was a pretty easy victory for him because he was already a war hero. There you can see the button that they used for the campaign actually has a picture of him in his uniform, in his cavalry uniform. After that, he was becoming pretty famous around the country, and he was William McKinley's vice president. And there you can see a picture of him on the right with William McKinley. McKinley was assassinated. And when he was assassinated, Teddy Roosevelt became president, and he was the youngest president at that time. He was only 42 years old, which maybe it doesn't seem that young to you, but seems pretty young to me. Next slide. As president, Roosevelt had something he called the Square Deal. And the Square Deal had what he also called the 3 C's of the Square Deal. That was conservation of natural resources. He was a avowed hunter and conservationist who wanted to preserve wild places but loved to kill things in those wild places. He wanted to control corporations so they wouldn't take advantage of people, and he wanted to protect the consumer. The 3 C's of the Square Deal. He was also what is known as a trust buster. If you remember, a trust is a huge corporation that has gobbled up other corporations. It's probably moving towards a monopoly. He broke those up to make these huge corporations less powerful, broke them into smaller corporations. And also he built up the Navy. His vision was for the country to be a world power on par with the most powerful countries in the world at that time, like Germany and England. Next slide. We talked about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and how it made everybody frightened of how food was processed in this country. Well, Roosevelt created the Meat Inspection Act. He worked with companies and unions to end strikes, the most famous of being a huge coal strike where he personally mediated between the company and the unions. The workers actually got more money for less hours, and the company actually ended up happy there too. He created the National Park System. Here's a picture of him in Yosemite National Park, or the Yosemite Valley back then. Now it's Yosemite National Park, with the most famous conservationist in American history, John Muir, on his right there. He created the Carnegie Foundation to encourage people to go into the profession of teaching, and he won re-election by the largest margin to that point in the history of America. And there he is running for re-election, giving a campaign speech. Pretty intense. Intense man. Next slide. Eventually, he decides not to run for re-election, despite he was insanely popular at that time. What he does do, because he loved nature and he loved hunting, he goes on a year-long African safari right after he finishes being president. He's working with Smithsonian Institute. It goes all across Africa. On this safari, he kills or traps over 11,000 animals. That's small animals, big animals, even some bugs and stuff. He brings 4 tons of salt with him on this safari so he can tan the hides and preserve them. And he sends almost 10,000 specimens back to museums, the Smithsonian in particular, but back to museums all across America. And he's really removed from the White House for over a year, but they talk about him in American papers more than they talk about the President of the United States, who was William Howard Taft at that time, because he's doing this amazing thing, and reporters are with him, and he's meeting heads of state, and he's meeting different tribes, and he's shooting elephants and giraffes and rhinoceros. And if you want to see pictures of the things that he kills, they're all over the internet. But I didn't feel like showing those pictures to you. Eventually, he comes back after a year. He had handpicked his predecessor, William Howard Taft, had guaranteed his supporters that William Howard Taft was just as progressive as he was, but William Howard Taft was not as progressive as he was. He says he was a progressive, but he was much more measured. He would rather have the courts do it than the president do it. So William Howard Taft actually had a very angry Teddy Roosevelt when Teddy Roosevelt got back, and we'll talk about what Teddy Roosevelt did in a different lecture.